Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Bernie Mach, and is Dr. Adam Dale with you today? No, just, okay, so Dr. Bernie Mach, integrating pest and pollinator management strategies for ornamental plant production. Welcome. Oh, sorry about that.
All right, since we just have a lightning round, I'm going to get straight into it. So monarch butterflies have been and are quickly becoming a really popular focal insect for backyard conservation efforts. And this largely means planting milkweed. Milkweed is the larval host of monarch caterpillars, and it's also an important source of floral resources of both nectar, primarily for the adult butterflies. Now, for our average homeowner here in the Southeast, here in Florida, this means planting non-native tropical milkweed. This is one of the most readily available species for sale at big box stores and local nurseries. And it has a couple of advantages compared to some of our native milkweed species, mainly that it doesn't senesce over the winter, it blooms for a much longer period of time, it stays tidier, doesn't tend to escape and send out runners as quickly as a lot of our native species. And it just in general stays a little bit more tidy, more compact, a little bit easier to manage. It's also very easy to grow and cultivate in our region. However, it doesn't come without its drawbacks. Like many species, the non-native tropical milkweed is also plagued by a key pest, namely the Oleander Aphid, which is this yellow insect you can see here on the stems, all along the stems and the flowers of this milkweed plant. Oleander aphids severely reduce plant quality. They can cause a buildup of honeydew and sooty mold. They can cause leaf senescence and even plant death in high enough infestations. In addition, infested milkweed are fairly unappealing to consumers because of this sooty mold, all of this mildew, and just in general, a kind of nasty, gunky looking plant. Now, aphid infestations are not only an aesthetic concern for growers, but they are also we've also shown that they negatively affect monarch larvae and adults. So we did a quick study last year where we found that adults ended up laying about 30% fewer eggs on heavily aphid infested milkweed compared to non-infested milkweed. And we also fed larvae infested milkweed leaves or uninfested milkweed leaves. So basically leaves that had all the gunk, had been experiencing those high aphid infestation pressures, and then leaves that were from plants that were clean, that hadn't experienced those pressures. And we found that the larvae ended up eating about 50% less of that aphid infested milkweed compared to the uninfested milkweed. And sort of logically, this meant that the larvae that were on the infested milkweed ended up growing and weighing about half as much as the larvae that fed on uninfested milkweed over the course of about 2 weeks, which is a pretty significant portion of their development as caterpillars. So we come to sort of this problem. Many of the insecticides that control aphids, logically, can also control monarchs. Many of the products that are labeled for aphid control are also labeled for caterpillar control. Sometimes this is at the same rate for caterpillar control. Sometimes it's at a different rate than for caterpillar control, but these are the same molecules that can hit both sets of insects. In addition, a lot of the insecticides that are commonly used in nursery production have largely unknown effects on monarchs specifically. They may have studied sort of toxicity on other caterpillar species, but especially when you have a group as diverse as insects, you can have a group of caterpillars that say react very strongly to a particular insecticide and then have another species that just doesn't really act quite as strongly to it just for genetic diversity reasons. And so in addition, most of the common insecticides that are currently used by growers, according to a survey done by my co-PI Jarrett Daniels in 2017, are not reduced risk or low impact, which are the insecticides that we would expect would have less impact on these caterpillars, on these beneficial insects. So our challenge is how to control aphids without controlling monarchs. And so our objective was really to look at the acute and chronic effects of insecticides, both to larvae and adults at application rates targeting these key pests. And basically we took some of the industry standard insecticides, we took some new to the market insecticides, and just sort of looked to see what they did to our caterpillars. So we did an acute exposure experiment where basically we treated a plant with our target insecticide. We treated them at foliar, via foliar spray at label rate. We field weathered these residues, which basically means we left the plant out there to experience normal weather conditions because this affects how much pesticide is left. And we tested exposure at 24 hours post-treatment, at 2 weeks post-treatment, and at 4 weeks post-treatment, trying to see how it degrades over time and what the effects are over time. We use a third instar larva, 1 petri dish, 1 leaf, switched it out 48 hours, see what died. And so we see our acute mortality results here with the blue bars, and we actually really didn't see much. This is kind of hopeful for us. Most of what was happening seemed to happen right at the 24 hours post-treatment, which is really soon after and kind of what we would expect. And about half of our treatments didn't have any acute exposure mortality. So we were like, yeah, this is exciting. This is kind of what we want. However, we decided to look at the chronic exposure as well, because sometimes things come out that you don't see in the acute. We did the same sort of setup, plants treated via foliar spray at label rate, field weathered residues. We tested at 24 hours, 2 weeks, and 4 weeks post-treatment. This time we caged essentially 1 third instar larva on a whole plant because we wanted to monitor them from when we put on the plant until they successfully formed a pupa and hopefully emerged as an adult, because we wanted to see that whole lifetime what happens. Monitored daily until death or eclosion. And we saw very different results. So we saw chronic effects up to 4 weeks post-treatment. Now these diagonal barred bars, for lack of a better word, show our mortality in our chronic experiment. And most of this happened right at the pupation stage. So you had a caterpillar that would appear to develop normally, and then right as it forms that J shape, right as it's trying to form that chrysalis, it dies. It fails to form that chrysalis properly. And so this was really interesting to us. It sort of showed that some of these insecticides, while they might not have really visible effects in the short term, can have very serious developmental effects in the long term. And of course, we worry about aphid control because that's kind of the whole point of what we're trying to do. So here's a quick little rundown of what we did for our aphid ratings. 0, little few to no live aphids that we could see. 1 was about 50 aphids per terminal growth point. 3 was heavily infested plants. You can't miss the aphids. Treatment thresholds is about 50 because this is where we start seeing damage and start noticing the pests. And I put our average aphid ratings in the orange line bar, and we could sort of see based on our treatment sort of threshold that many of our products varied greatly in their ability to actually control aphids. We see our soap in that top, for y'all it would be left-hand corner, really didn't drop below the threshold at all. Some of our highly toxic products ended up having fairly good aphid control. And so it's a complicated, messy picture, and we're going to have to do more to sort of figure out what our best options may be. But obviously this duration of aphid control versus duration of negative effects on monarchs is going to be one of the key factors that we have to pay attention to moving forward. And it really emphasizes the need for other non-pesticide methods of controlling and reducing aphid populations to successfully manage these pests on milkweed. And of course, it's going to have to be a careful balance between these negative effects caused by aphids, of course, and the negative effects caused by insecticides. And with that, I'd like to thank my research supporters and my lab who helped me get everything up. And I think I have just a little time for questions.
Yeah, you have a minute and a half, so maybe like one question.
Here in the front, I just.
Does the native milkweed, is it less susceptible to aphids?
The question was, is the native milkweed less susceptible to aphids? So it really varies from species to species. Milkweed have secondary plant defensive chemicals, cardenolides, that sort of have a role in how susceptible they are, but it really varies species to species. Some of our native species get them hit really hard, and some of our native species don't get hit quite as hard. So it's a really mixed bag.
Yeah, we can take one more.
Back there in the back with the gray shirt and the facial hair.
Go.
Yes. Magnificent, by the way.
So I have a question regarding, I've heard a concern about the non-native, the milkweed that you're researching about its phenology being longer than natives and affecting my migration patterns. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Okay, so the question was speaking to tropical milkweed and its potential propensity for messing up monarch migration because it blooms for longer and can sort of steal monarchs away from their normal path. So it's complicated. In other areas where they're migrating down to Mexico, it seems to be more of a concern because it means they might stop over in places like South Texas, where it can get cold enough in the winter to kill off those monarchs that might just stop and start reproducing there. Here in Florida, there's a lot of debate as to whether some of the monarchs that are coming through here are going down to Cuba or staying in Florida, because we do have a resident population now in South Florida, or are going across the Gulf again to Mexico. I don't really study that in particular, so I can't give you, unfortunately, a more nuanced view on that, but it is an issue, and one of the recommendations can be to control your milkweed during the winter, either by cutting off blooms or by just, again, cutting it back. Here we get cold enough where it does senesce a little bit and does die back a little bit in the winter, not as full as the other native milkweed species, but if you're not keeping it up in the winter, it will die back.
Thank you.